We gather together for our Thursday Bible study. And as I mentioned, I'm just going to talk to everybody here online at the moment. As I mentioned, we're going to be transitioning here to having Bible study online and in person at the same time. So last week, we wrapped up going all the way through the book of James. So we finished going through, this is the first time we've gotten together since the beginning of COVID. Does that sound about right? So it's been too long. It's been too long. And gathering together in person is going to take us a little while to get back in the saddle again for us all. I think there was also a slight hiccup on the timing. So we'll just go on forward. So bless you all as we've been gathering together, having gone all the way through the book of Isaiah, having gone through James this last summer. And so where we're going to go now, I mentioned this last week online, we're going to go through the book of Ruth, and then we're just going to follow through those historical books right there. So Ruth, and then 1st and 2nd Samuel, and then 1st and 2nd Kings. And I'm still trying to think of how I want to do 1st and 2nd Kings, because you have 1st and 2nd Kings and you have 1st and 2nd Chronicles that cover some of the exact same things. And so part of me is thinking of possibly doing 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles together, just to get the fullness of each one of the stories as it goes forward. Or sometimes there are sections of them where they're identical. One of the fascinating things when you get especially to 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, is you get these little commentaries in there where it says, and if you want to learn more, just go to the book of the Chronicles of this king. But we don't have those books anymore. We don't have those anymore around us. So it's like, I want to go to those books, probably do not exist. If they did, I would love to go through every last little piece of those books. But at times it seems that both the author of Kings and the author of Chronicles goes back to the same source material. And so they go back to the same thing and they write it verbatim, one to the other. So still trying to think how I would want to do all of that going forward. On the other hand, that's probably about 6 months out from now. So we got a little bit of time to think on all of that. 1st and 2nd Samuel, that gets obviously to Samuel and Saul and King David. And then it leads right on up to Kings and Chronicles. However, I thought we would start with Ruth, with really kind of fits going right forward with those other books. Now, in our English, our modern edition, Ruth comes right before 1st and 2nd Samuel, which in my mind fits pretty good. Because right there is where we've got the historical section of the Old Testament, pretty much going from Joshua all the way up through Chronicle. Well, actually going all the way up through Esther are kind of considered the historical books. So you would lead, it kind of goes from going into the promised land and the history of God at work all the way up until you run into the Persian Empire. So you've got a good 800 years of time frame of history in that period. However, you get to the Hebrew version of the Bible, of the Old Testament, and they actually stick Ruth more at the what's called the writing section. So you actually have, just want to make sure I got it right here, you actually, in the Hebrew, you actually have Proverbs, then Ruth, then Song of Solomon. So it's an interesting place for it to be put. I think it fits a whole lot better where we've got it. Sometimes I prefer the Hebrew, but for Ruth especially, it fits like a glove right here, where you go Joshua and Judges and Ruth, especially when we get to that first verse there. And I'll just read the first verse. In the days when the judges ruled. And so we'll just stop right there. That's why I think it fits perfect here. So, in other words, the first words of Ruth are during the book of Judges, this happened and took place. And there's about an 11-year span in there where this probably took place. And so, obviously, you're talking Ruth and Boaz. That's in the line that leads up to King David. And so you're looking at, make sure I think, I'd have to double check, but I believe that Ruth and Boaz would have been the great grandparents of King David. There might be another great in there, but I'd have to relook that up. So I'm pretty sure that they were the great grandparents of King David. King David, his reign was from about 1009 BC to about 970 BC. So right at about 1000 BC is where we run into King David. So if you're going to hop back a few generations, you're looking in the 1100s BC when we come here into the book of Ruth. So that's about the time frame that we're looking at. If you want to talk archaeologically, this would have King David is right at the beginning of the Iron Age. And so a lot of what takes place there is technology. Who's got the best technology? And you can look at wars around the world today. That's how they're mostly won today, isn't it? Who's got the best technology? Not necessarily who's got the biggest armies. I think China's got the biggest army, most number of people that are in the army. But that doesn't make a lot of difference today. It's who's got the technology. And it really has never changed. And so when you get to King David, that's where the Israelites figure out how to have iron weapons. And so if on one side you've got bronze weapons, and on the other side you've got iron weapons, who's going to win? The iron weapons are going to win. Because sword on sword, the bronze breaks, the iron keeps working. And so it's technology. And during King David, that's where they found how to work iron. Now that we've got iron, that's where you then have the growth of the kingdom of Israel. And so it is who's got the best technology that oftentimes goes forward in how it all happens. Nevertheless, even when we can go forward with archaeology and get all of that kind of stuff, we can definitely go forward and see God at work, even when God doesn't put his name onto it. So is God at work with discovering of technology? Absolutely. Is God at work in the midst of famine and all those things that take place? Absolutely. And I bring up famine because that's really what brings Naomi and her family out of Israel to Moab, and then brings them on. And then after all that happens there, they come back because there is no more famine in Bethlehem. So it's God. And so one of the themes throughout the book of Ruth here is God at work in history. If you see somebody that's coming, okay.
Yeah, someone's coming, but I can't see a face. All I see is feet.
Okay. Yeah, and so for those watching at home, we'll see where this how everything takes place as we go forward. I think when I looked on it, as we were wrapping up the book of James, I think we were having about 80 or so views online, following along with the book of James. So if you've got that many people watching along with you, yeah, we keep going. So, and I'm just learning a little bit of how to get this going, doing online and live at the same time. I'm learning as time goes along. Seems like the whole last 2 years, doesn't it? Yep. So we come back here to Ruth. And so that's kind of the time frame that we'll be looking at for the next several weeks. I just kind of want to hit some of the broader topics here. Who wrote Ruth? No idea. No clue. But kind of going through Ruth, we can tell a couple of things. It was probably written during the reign of King David. And so probably King David is the one that had this all codified and put down and written during his reign. So it was so while it happened, let's say 120, 130, 140 years before it was written down, it would have been during King David's reign that it was written down. So whomever wrote it most likely was part of King David's court and knew King David. Part of the book of Ruth also brings us forward with King David's reign, because it's kind of really focused on David. All of what God's doing through Ruth, but David having written down, this is what God has done in my family in fulfilling his promises. And so it's God's fulfilling his promises throughout. It was also written by somebody who was very well educated in the day, just because of how everything is put together. Out of all the books of the Bible, Ruth may be the best story in how it's put together out of all the books of the Bible. Now, story does not mean fiction. You can have a story that is fact. And that's what we would run into here with the book of Ruth. This is a story written during King David's lifetime of his great grandmother, or it could be great great grandmother, as I said before. Could be either case. But this is that story. And this is before it was written down, it was a audible story, an oral story. But all of us have those things, don't we? Could you give a story that you heard about your great grandmother? Maybe. I could give stories of my grandparents, very much so. And they told me some stories of their parents. But I could tell stories of my grandmother. And is this written down anywhere? No. But one story of my grandmother during World War II, my grandmother and my grandfather both were in Columbus, Nebraska. My grandfather went off to war. He fought in the Pacific. He was part of the Air Corps in World War II. My grandmother moved to Omaha during the war. And what she did is during World War II, it was at Omaha that a lot of the bombers were put together. So that's where that manufacturing took place. And there's a lot of things that need to be put together. I believe even like later on in the war, the super fortresses, the B-52s and things were all put together in Omaha. And my grandmother, as she worked in the factories in order to put together the bombers for the war effort, her job was the tying of the cables inside her and other people inside the bombers. And so I can remember she even had this wood thing where she had done all the tying on it, little cuts with the ties that she did, of how she would tie different steel cables onto different parts of the planes as she was putting this together for the war. And I could go deeper into that story. But suffice to say, that's not written down anywhere, is it? But is it a story? Yes, it is. Is it a true story? Absolutely. Is it an oral story? Yes, it is. And so, kind of what I'm saying is that story of my grandmother, that's what the book of Ruth was before it was written down by King David. It was the family, and this was an incredible story of what happened. This was King David's family telling the story of what great grandma did, which is pretty. And so that's all that I'm saying. That's right there. But you also, when you're doing an oral history like that, there's telltale things that take place that you can tell that it's an oral story as opposed to something that's put together exceedingly tightly. And so the book of Ruth has all these earmarks of being an oral story. And I had to write these all down. Basically, in an oral story, it's additive as opposed to subordinate. In other words, you just keep adding on. This is what was going on in the story. And so, as I was talking about the story of my grandmother, you're talking about the tying of the knots, and then how my grandmother had all these steel cables with the knots on this wooden plank. Is that talking about the wooden plank and the steel knots key to that story? Not really. But is that part of when we talk about a story? Yeah. And so an oral story has those kind of additional things that are added in. Instead of having everything analyzed, that it all has to be exact of what all this has a meaning. Sometimes an oral story just gives more of what's going on than you even need it. It's a gathering story. In other words, all the gathering of what took place instead of analytical, meaning this happened and this is what it means. Sometimes you just tell the story, and the story itself tells what's going on. That's an oral story. There's a lot of redundancy in an oral story. And I'm not going to go through all set, well, I'll just very quickly. Traditional versus creative, acoustical versus visual, life experience instead of abstract, verbal, and praise that's going on. And so a lot of with an oral story, you're telling the story. As opposed to what we have often when we write things on down. And so kind of two last things here. Oral stories are redundant, meaning you say the same thing more than once. Why? To hit the ear. In other words, an oral story is meant to be heard. An oral story is not meant to be read and not verbalized. Another way of an oral story, you could have it written down, but you're verbalizing it as you're reading it, which really is much of the scriptures. It's meant to be heard as it goes forward, as opposed to be just sit down and read. Is it awesome that we can do that? Yeah. That is awesome that we can do that. But it was put in a culture that was meant to be heard. And so a lot of times when you run into the poetry, especially in the Hebrew, it's meant to rhyme. In the English translation, it doesn't rhyme so much. And why do you rhyme? It gets into your memory. What was the old saw about Columbus sailing the ocean blue? Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. Is that right? And why? You have a rhyme in the midst of that to help keep your memory, right? What is part of the reason for poetry in the scripture? To be able to keep it in memory. Or same thing with hymns too. Hymns are put together with music Why? Two reasons. One, it hits the memory better, right? If I were to start with, say, Amazing Grace, what's the next words? How sweet the sound. Why do you know that? You've sung it before, and it hits the memory that it hits in there. And secondly, it's also praise to the Lord, right? And so, oral story is a lot more praise as it all brings forward to. And so, those are all oral stories. And that's what those kind of things in here we find in the book of Ruth. And lastly, we also see in the book of Ruth, it's put forward just as people talk. In other words, it's not put together in a high grammatical Hebrew. It's put together in the Hebrew of the way that people speak. In English, you could say that it's not written in Shakespearean English. Can we figure out Shakespearean English? Yes, we could. You could say that sometimes Isaiah, he kind of sometimes writes in Shakespearean Hebrew. Highfalutin, poetic, all these different ways of talking. Ruth's got a little bit of poetry in it, but even that poetry is like, this seems to be poetry, but we're not sure because it's written for us to speak it. Just written for us to speak and hear what's going on in the book. A couple of last things, just looking at it from a top-down look. Some of the main points in the book of Ruth, one of them is suffering. One of them is God at work in the midst of suffering. So we see a lot of similar ways of looking at things to the book of Job. So theologically, Ruth and Job have a lot of connections between the two of them because of all of the things that Job went through, and here, all the things that Naomi went through. Remember, Job lost all his kids. What happens to Naomi? She loses her husband and her two sons. And so a lot of similarity there in suffering and a lot of connections in redemption too, that we have a redeemer. And so, which brings me to the next point. And I'm not going to get into all of what it is, but we'll get to that as we get along, especially that chapter 2, chapter 3. Ruth, interestingly, also has the most complex legal situation in all the Bible. You've read Ruth before. And so the whole coming back to Israel, and then a kinsman redeemer, and then a brother-in-law marrying his wife's widow in order to take care of the inheritance, in order to take care, and then who's going to take care of what needs to be done so that the widows are watched over and cared for, and how you work with marriage, and who gets. This is the most complex legal situation in all of Scripture. In these 4 chapters. But we'll get into that a little bit later. But it's talking about redemption, is the point. And Ruth does look forward to the Redeemer that will happen and take place. And so that's where, when we go through Ruth, we do see God at work. We also see the redemption that will take place fully and finally in Jesus Christ, who is our Redeemer. Because what's the great Easter hymn? I know that my Redeemer lives, right? And that hymn really goes back a lot here to Ruth, to what is a Redeemer. What does it mean to be redeemed? But we'll get into that as we go through the book. And the last 2 points, One point and then basic outline. One of the main theological points throughout Ruth is God at work in history to save his people. Sometimes he puts the big banner on it. Easter, Jesus is risen. Our sins are forgiven. That's God putting his name on it in neon lights, our salvation. Or East or on Christmas. And you bring the shepherds and you got the choir of angels singing. The choir of angels would be neon lights as they are singing and proclaiming what the Lord has done. However, sometimes God doesn't put his neon lights on what he's doing. Very similar in that regards to the book of Esther. Because in Esther, Esther is the one book in all of Scripture God's not mentioned. Yet, what's the point of the entire book of Esther? God saving his people. Ruth uses the name, and in fact uses the personal name of God, which would be Yahweh, which is the I am, as it goes forward. And lastly, probably out of all the books of the Bible, Ruth might have the very best divisions of chapters. The entire first chapter, here's the dilemma. The second chapter, here is the hope. The third chapter, Ruth taking the risk. And the last chapter, here is the solution of the salvation that happens. And so it is one of the best stories and one of the best written stories. Whoever the author of Ruth was one of the best storytellers of his day, with how it's all incredibly put together, which means it probably was not King David. King David was incredible in poetry, incredible in making hymns, incredible in music. Those were his gifts. What was not one of his gifts? Storytelling was not one of his gifts. He could put the story like Psalm 23 and make an incredible hymn of it, an incredible psalm. And that's a gift. I have no gift. I don't have anything like that gift. But the gift of bringing forward and telling the story was not one of his gifts. So it would have been probably somebody in his court that brought this forward. So that's kind of looking at Ruth all the way up here. And that's kind of the themes, the history, the place, all of those type of stuff before we get into the actual going through the book of Ruth. And let's see here. Gone through the first half hour doing that. Any thoughts, questions, or things that kind of pop up in your mind there? And I have to apologize if I just keep on speaking, because that's what I've done for the last 2.5 years in this Bible study. Because as soon as, 2 weeks before Easter when we ran into COVID, and I went at that point from when we were gathering together down in the fellowship hall. And then all of a sudden, it was, let's see here. Alan was here. And then Kevin, Penny, and Paul, and myself. And I think it was almost 10 weeks where that was about the only people that came into the building for a while there. As we were working through things and figuring out how to do the care ministry and helping the kids to do school and all of those type of things. And so for almost the last 2.5 years, I've done this Bible study staring straight at the computer for a half hour. And I think I got a little bit better at it as time went on. But that's kind of where that all, anyway. I apologize, but that's what I've trained myself for the last 2.5 years here. I found out I can keep on speaking for an hour and not be interrupted. So to the beginning of the book of Ruth, the first 5 verses of the book of Ruth very much are the introduction. Here's what's going on. So verse 1, in the days when the judges ruled. So obviously pre-Samuel would have been viewed as the last of the judges. And so it was before that. Like I said a little ways earlier, I think a good thought might have been during the days of one of the judges at Elam. Elam fought the Moabites. You'll see that in a moment here. And then the Moabites are kind of subject to Israel. And so my guess is probably a little bit after that, because there was good ties with the Moabites at that time. So that's my guess, but that's not an absolute in there either. So the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And so there you have the introduction. The man's name that we're going to find in a moment is Elimelech. Verse 2 gives us his name. But it kind of gives forward, and you can kind of see, King David or others in his family telling this story, and then somebody in his court writing it down and putting it into the incredible story that we have today. But you can kind of just tell here a little bit what that is. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So you can kind of just, at the beginning there, you can tell how it's an oral story. This doesn't begin like Paul's letters. Remember Paul's letters and the epistles? Grace, mercy, and peace to you from God our Father and our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. I pray for my Lord every day for you as I remember you and all. That's pretty strict, isn't it? Or you get to the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. And the Gospel of Luke, he gives thanks kind of to Theophilus for making it possible to write the Gospel of Luke. And he gives an introduction, and this is what I'm doing. Here, it's the start of a story, a true story, but it is a story. And so it's this storytelling format. So you can almost imagine in your mind kind of what's going on. You're all gathered together. And here you are. You've got the court in Jerusalem. King David is there. You've got all the other people together. You've got the fire going. You've all eating or have just eaten. The storyteller goes up to tell the stories of God's work, God's action. And he comes forward before everybody. And he says, and he begins as he tells the story. In the days when the judges ruled. So you can just kind of get the feel for how this was brought forward and shared. There was a famine in the land. And the people in that day were around subsistence living. So in other words, if you had a couple of bad crops, hop on in.
Is it 10:45?
It was 10 o'clock. And so
I thought it said on the bulletin 10:45.
there was a little mistake in it. Hop on in, though, for the last bit. Anyway, the first half hour of our getting together was an overview of what's going on.
Ruth,
And yep. And so now we're just starting going into the book of Ruth.
I'll get a Bible out there.
Okay, well, we got one right there.
Oh,
We got a whole pile of them right on over there. So I'm just going to go take a look for a second, see if anybody else is coming on up, okay? Be right back.
And that time worked out so well. I could go to exercise class, have a few minutes, and then come here.
Oh, no, you're gonna have to compromise. Which one are you gonna do?
Right.
I think that might be a hymnal. That might be a hymnal.
Yep, that's it. I'll get you a Bible.
Well, here, there's advice,
Here, here.
I'll take that one back.
And in fact, I'll get you the easier to read Bible. How's that?
And yes,
Yep, the big print one is the one that I use for the services and all of that too. Because if I'm reading at it,
oh, okay.
I don't want to be going and the so I keep it where I can easily see it with how everything's going on. So we're at Ruth chapter 1. And if we want to adjust it to 1045, we could. But we'll talk about that later on. So in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. We were just talking about how this is a oral speaking storyteller. That's the image of how this is going forward. It's not a high prose speaking. This is orally speaking, is how this is written. So it's written for us to hear. A man of Bethlehem. And if we were speaking in Hebrew, the people would get the irony immediately right there. The irony is there was a famine in the land. And Bethlehem, do you know what the Bethlehem means in Hebrew? House of bread. So Beth is house. Bethlehem is house of bread. In other words, the house that has an abundance of bread and food. So we don't get it in the English language, but the original hearers would have heard famine, which means lack of bread. And he's coming from Bethlehem, the house of bread. So there's an immediate irony taking place right there in the very beginning. So there was a lack of bread, and there was a man from the house of bread in Judah. Remember, Bethlehem, about a few miles south of Jerusalem, is where Bethlehem is at. And yes, this is where King David came from. And yes, this is where you get the shepherds in their fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. And it's going back to this, where Joseph would have viewed his lineage, Joseph and Mary, their lineage going back to David, going back to Bethlehem, going back to Ruth, which is fascinating because you get to the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, and it begins with that long genealogy. And there's 4 women that are mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus, which would have been exceedingly abnormal. When you're writing that down, typically you're going to go through all the male heirs. Each one of the female heirs is there for a reason. One of the reasons is the book of Ruth, that Jesus, the Redeemer, came out of the lineage going back to Ruth, a Moabitess, a Gentile, to bring forward salvation. And so going back to Ruth is part of what Matthew is doing at the beginning of his book. And so we get to all of this. And then he came to Moab. Nothing new. There being a famine and leaving there. Remember, Abraham went to Egypt when there was a famine. Remember Joseph in Egypt. And then he brought all of his, with the long story. Joseph eventually then brought his family to Egypt because there was a famine in the land. So going to another land when there's a famine is a normal thing we see throughout the scriptures too. Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, Isaac at one point. They leave because of a famine. They go there, and then God brings them back to the promised land. He watches over them in the midst of all of that. And so that is a common, so this is nothing abnormal. And they go to Moab. Now, Moab would have been east of the Jordan River, So kind of east of Jericho and going south, which would have been east of the Dead Sea. The Moabites came out of the lineage of Lot. The Edomites, which would have been just south of them, also came from the lineage of Lot. And that is Lot, who would have been with Abraham. Remember, Abraham goes to Sodom and Gomorrah, and he brings them out, and Lot's wife turns back, looks at it, and turns to a pillar of salt. That Lot. So out of Lot and his two daughters come the Moabites and the Edomites. The Moabites, that's the one that we're looking at right now. So that's who they are. And you could marry somebody from Moab because it went through that direction. When they came into the land just after Moses, remember there was all those restrictions. Do not marry this group. Do not marry with that group. Do not marry with the Philistines. We know what happened with the Philistines when you get to Samson. Instead, the Moabites, because it came through Lot and the Edomites, they could marry. And in fact, if you go all the way up to Jesus' date, and you run into Herod the Great, he was not Jewish. He was of Moab and Edom. So he was half-blooded. So he came out of that grouping coming forward. But because of a book like this, because Ruth was a Moabitess, the people of Israel did not have a problem with King Herod then becoming basically their king as time went along. So that's where you get all the way forward. But King Herod very much promoted the book of Ruth because it helped to give him authority in being king of Israel. See, Ruth was a Moabitess. You shouldn't have a problem. And most people didn't, partly because of the book of Ruth. So it's just interesting, all the connections that happen and take place over time. So they went to Moab. Verse 2. The name of the man was, oh wait, did I just do that? Yep. The name of the man was Elimelech. And Elimelech means God is my king. And all the names in Israel had different names. And Elimelech, beautiful name, God, Yahweh is my king. So that's what the meaning of his name. And he's going to be out of the picture very soon. And the names of his two sons were Malone and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. So King David was an Ephrathite. You had two groups. You had the lineages of the tribes that came out of the children of Isaac, right? Two of them were cut up from Joseph. This would have been one of them. So here you have the Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. So this is then the lineage of King David. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. So there was a famine. So this is how migration happens, right? You go to a new land. Okay, we're just going to go there for a little while. And then what happens? You end up staying there, right? There's been a number of people that have immigrated from Mexico to the United States. A lot of them in their immigration was, I'm going to go to the United States to find a job, to earn some money, to help my family that's back home. And then once I've earned enough money, then I'll go back home, right? There's a lot of people, I know a number of people, that was their intention. Guess where they ended up staying? They ended up getting to America. They ended up seeing, they ended up with a job, they ended up marrying, they ended up having kids. So what do? You stay. You end up staying. And so that's part of our history. That's what's going on here. They went there. We're just going to stay there to weather out the famine because they've got food there. Then we'll go back to Bethlehem. But time takes place. And that's where this all goes forward. So Elimelech, the husband, so that all happens. They go there and they remain there. They migrated. And if everything else had stayed the same, what probably would have happened with Naomi and Ruth?
Nothing.
They probably would have stayed there, right? They probably would have stayed right there in Moab. But, and this is then where you get to verse 3. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. So now we get, and here you get in some of the connections then with Job. Job lost his children, not his wife. Here, though, Naomi loses her husband and then loses her sons. And so she is going to be viewed as destitute, is where this is going to all be viewed at and left at. She loses her husband. Okay, so who's supposed to take care of her now? Her eldest son. So her eldest son is the one who is then to take care of her. That's why the eldest son received a double share in the inheritance. So let's say you had 3 sons. One son would receive 50% of the inheritance, and then the second and third son would each receive 25% of the inheritance. Why? Well, the eldest son had the responsibility of taking care of mom and dad. So he had more responsibility. He had more things to pay for. Therefore, he received a bigger piece of the inheritance. So when you get to the parable of the prodigal son, the son that stayed would have gotten 2/3 of the inheritance. The prodigal son that left, that he sold, would have only sold about 1/3 of the inheritance. So when you have the father talking to the son and says, look, everything that I have is yours, he could have easily said, and you know what? It's still 2/3 of the stuff. He did sell it. He did use it wrong, but it still was only 1/3 of the inheritance. You, the elder son, still have 2/3 that's coming your way. And so that's what's going on. Her sons would have been responsible for taking care of her. Then the next steps. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years. So you got a 10-year period. And both Malone and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Now, therein is the tragedy of what's going on. You would have had the inheritance that generally would have gone through the men. She had no other children anyway. So what happens to her? She is all alone. Today we at least have what, Social Security? If you've worked long enough in a place, you might have a retirement that comes from that. You might have money in a 401k, among other things, right? So you've got, or you might have put things in stocks or whatever for retirement. That's kind of how, in our culture, we make sure that somebody that's gotten older is taken care of, right? At least that's the thought process. Yep.
So you're telling us that if there hadn't been anything, would Ruth have gotten it because she was a woman?
Well, she was over here. So she basically was losing everything.
But, I mean, even in this way.
Oh, yeah. If Ruth, well, and we'll get to this next week.
Okay.
What basically would have happened is they would have returned to their fathers. Remember when I said earlier that this is the most complex legal situation in all of Scripture? 4 chapters, the most complex legal. And so this gets to exactly what you were saying. So she would have gone back, if they had stayed. They would have gone back to their father's house and maybe gotten married again. Now you have a dowry that's given. So they would have given a dowry, a certain amount of money, land, whatever it may be, to the husband as he was marrying their daughter. So that's how it worked in that culture. So here you're getting married. Here is the wedding price. And there was discussion about what that would have been. And that would have gone with the husband. The husband dies. The daughter goes back. Guess what then goes back to? You got it. So then the dowry is going to go back no matter what. So for both sons, even though Ruth doesn't go back to her father's house, and the idea was now it's gone back so that this can then be used to help her to get married again. So that was the thought process there. And so now all of that and so died. So what happened to all of the stuff that she and her husband had? It went to the sons. So now that the dad died, the inheritance was split among the sons. 2/3 to the oldest, 1/3 to the youngest. Then they die. All of their stuff is basically belonging to the sons, but now what is owned by them goes back to the other households. Where does that leave Naomi? In a world of hurt. In a best case situation, one of those households, preferably the where the older son, would have allowed her to come and live with them. If she had stayed in Moab, that was the best case scenario. Would that have happened? We don't know. They didn't have to. They could have just said, you're out of luck. So there was nothing that was definite to take care of her. And then she would have been living at just the grace of that household. And so what does Naomi do? I'm going to go home to Bethlehem. Famine's over. There's extended family there. I'm going to go there. And the going back is where we're going to get to next week. So it is that's why she would have been destitute at that moment. And when she goes back to Bethlehem, she is in poverty. That's why she sends Ruth out to glean the fields after everything's been done as one of the poor. Because that she's got nothing and everything because of the whole legal situation is gone. And at best, if this would have happened, she would have been allowed to hang around one of the other families. So that's a dire situation. Any last thoughts or questions as we kind of go forward here today? Well, we'll talk about when we want to kind of get started here next week. I'm going to end our Bible study online right now. May the Lord bless you and keep you this day and always going forward in his name.